Good evening. So tonight we are going to look at lessons 9 through 11 in the book, and that's going to take us pretty much from the turn of the century of the 1900s to roughly today. It doesn't go all that recently, and we'll go more into the present day in future. But for tonight, we're going to be looking at mostly stuff that happened throughout the 1900s. But we're going to start back a little bit with some movements, some things that happened in the early American Mennonite church. So the first chapter here is about awakening movements, and that's just kind of a broad thing he uses to talk about several of the movements that affected Mennonites after they came to the U.S. So the first one we're going to talk about is Pietism. And in 1675, a man by the name of Philip Spener released a book or a booklet by the name of Pious Desires, in which he outlined 6 emphases that should be put on. And I'm just going to read over these and think about these in the context of Anabaptism. This man was not an Anabaptist, but this is what he said. Number 1, increase Bible reading and study. Number 2, priesthood of all believers. Number 3, faith consists of practice, including love for one's enemies. Number 4, purity of doctrine is maintained by holiness of life. Number 5, ministers themselves must be Christian. Proper ordination and knowledge of pure doctrine alone do not suffice. And number 6, sermons should be a means of bringing salvation to the hearer. Saying that in contrast to just a way of presenting knowledge. It should be a way of actually bringing salvation to the hearer. Now, if we think about that in the context of Anabaptism, that sounds pretty familiar. All of those seem to be things that are tied in with Anabaptism. Anabaptists preached priesthood of all believers, personal Bible reading. They were very strong on faith consisting of practice, that if our faith isn't worked out in our lives, then it's not true faith. And that kind of is mirrored in the next one as well, a focus on holiness of life. And that's the way we retain purity of doctrine. And then also holding our ministers to high standards, and our preaching being not just about a way of showing how knowledgeable someone is, but actually a way to bring salvation to the hearer. And so when you look at that, it makes sense why Anabaptists latched onto this. And you'll notice this was released in 1675, so this was even before Mennonites were coming to America. And back in Europe, his book was popular among the Anabaptists. It was something they read, it was something they liked, and so that was there. But as the Anabaptists came to America, and I said in the last lesson, or the last night we were talking, that they were living among a bunch of other denominations. They were sharing meeting houses with Lutherans and Reformed, and they were a part of this. And they came to the point where they decided they need a way, they needed to figure out what they believe, and they needed to write that out. And so in 1725, the Mennonites held their first conference in the New World, and it was there that they adopted the Dordrecht Confession of Faith. Now, if you remember from our last lesson, the Dordrecht Confession of Faith was written by the Dutch Anabaptists in the 1600s. And it's the one that the Amish still use today, and I think many Mennonites as well. And it was just a way of saying, this is what we believe, and that's how we define our churches and who's in our church. In 1736, a man by the name of August Spangenberg, came to Pennsylvania, and he tried to unite different groups of Christians. He came and thought, listen, there are so many different splits of Christians here in America, especially in Pennsylvania he came to, and he was like, there are all these people, we need to come together, we need to understand the things that we are together. And he was backed by Count von Zinzendorf, which Conrad mentioned when he was talking about that song that we just sang. That song was written by him. He was very strong on brotherhood and coming together. And so that was what August Spangenberg wanted to do as well. And so he held a series of conferences between all the Christians in Pennsylvania. And Mennonites came to the first couple, but they stopped coming for a little bit, or after a little bit, along with some other groups. They weren't the only group that stopped coming. And the main reason why they disagreed with Spangenberg and the Pietists was that the Pietists were willing to accept the idea of an invisible church. That within the true church, there was kind of an invisible church, the true believers. And that doesn't have to be in like a gathered group. And the way this was defined was someone who had a real personal experience of salvation. It was about the personal experience. Did you meet Jesus? Have you been saved? And it didn't matter if you were coming to the same church. It was just a matter of being saved and having this experience. And the Mennonites rejected that because they preferred, or they believed in, quote, a visible, gathered, disciplined group. That true Christians, if you're truly saved and you're truly, a brotherhood, you're going to be coming together and meeting together. You're going to submit yourself to discipline of the group. And that's how the true church is formed. So I should say with this whole pietism thing, pietism was very much about that personal experience. It was very much about having a personal relationship with God, which is something that is pretty Protestant and was in other Protestant denominations as well. But it didn't always line up with what the Mennonites held about living out your faith. Personal salvation is not just about a relationship with God, it's also about living out that relationship. And then the next section in this book, he talks about the Pennsylvania German revival, and he puts several groups under this German revival. The first group was formed around 1778 under the leadership of Jacob Engel. These people started meeting because they disagreed with some things. It was kind of a variety of things that they disagreed with in the different churches they were going to. But they kind of came under the leadership of Jacob Engel, and they came to be called the River Brethren, which your book says that was because they practiced baptism by immersion, which was a very big deal for them. And they would, as the book said, go to their nearest, if someone was saved and wanted to be baptized, they'd just go to the nearest river and baptize them. There's disagreement on that. Some say that it was actually because the main group of the River Brethren were from southeast Lancaster County, close to the Susquehanna River, so they were the River Brethren, the brethren out by the river. But either one makes sense, and both are true as well. In 1800, then, there's another group that was formed under the leadership of Philip Otterbein, who was from the Reformed Church, and Martin Bohm, who was from the Mennonite Church, or had been. He was excommunicated for some of his preaching. He tended to be pretty Methodist. I don't know exactly what all that means, but he was excommunicated for not backing down on some of those things. And then he and Philip Otterbein went on to form a group called the United Brethren in Christ. Again, I don't know a whole lot about this group. From what I can tell, they still exist to this day. An interesting fact I found was that a future bishop of the United Brethren in Christ was a man by the name of Milton Wright, whose sons Wilbur and Orville are very famous. But I don't know much about that group other than that. All right, so moving on to the third section of this lesson that he talks about is revivalism. And he starts by talking about Charles Finney. Charles Finney was an evangelist in the early 1800s, and he was one of the first big popular evangelists who would do these big meetings, where everyone would come and he would, preach fire and brimstone, and then he'd have an altar call at the end where everyone who wants to be saved can come to the front and be saved. And he was very strong on, like the Pietists, a radical conversion experience. And this was very much on the experience. Have you experienced this conversion? Have you experienced God? One of the things that would happen at these meetings was something called prevailing prayer. It was a sort of, I don't know, it would be kind of akin to like speaking in tongues, but like this kind of thing where you're just praying and you're controlled by the Spirit, and you'd be wailing and writhing around on the ground for hours sometimes. And this was a true experience of God. And the Mennonites reacted to some of that. Obviously, they, being as the Mennonites are, very proper and not willing to do that kind of stuff. Actually, like outlawed some prayer meetings and so on, which made some people think that they were against prayer, which was not true, but that's where they came from. And Charles Finney wasn't the only one doing this. There were other camp meetings and so on that were happening even before him, but he was one of the first famous ones that was doing a lot of this. So then the book gives some comparisons between revivalism and Anabaptism, especially the Anabaptism of that day. And I just want to go over a few of them. This isn't all of the ones that the book gives. But some of the things that where Anabaptism differed from revivalism. And so the first one is in salvation. Like I said, revivalism was about individual experience. Experiencing salvation, or experiencing Christ is what salvation is about. Anabaptists said that that needs to include church participation. If when you're baptized, you become a member of the church, that just goes hand in hand. If you're saved, you're a part of the body as well. On emotional expressions, revivalism was all about that. Emotional expressions were the proof of spiritual life. If you were, just doing this prevailing prayer, or were just really emotional about your experiences, that was proof that the Spirit was working in you. And the Anabaptists tended to see that as improper and irreverent, to be wailing all over the place in church. And then another big thing was Sunday school. Revivalism was kind of the first group that brought about Sunday school, and this was a big deal for the Mennonites for the past century about if we do Sunday school and how we do Sunday school and all that. But revivalism was all about, get them as young as you can, evangelize to these children. That's what's important. But that clashed a little bit with Anabaptists when one of the big reasons why they split off from the Protestants and why men gave their lives was for this idea of adult baptism. That baptism and salvation and inclusion in the church is it's a choice, and it has to be a conscious choice. And there's a point where children are too young to make that conscious choice. And so they believe children are safe. We don't need to be evangelizing to all these children. Obviously, there's a balance there of, trying to teach children, but also not trying to save them. But over time, this revivalistic influence started coming into the Mennonite church, and there were Mennonite revival meetings. The first ones were held in 1872 by John Funk and Daniel, that's spelled wrong, Brenneman. And I believe that was in eastern Pennsylvania. I think Lancaster County, but I don't know for sure. But they held these sort of revival meetings, kind of the same style that Finney was doing. And afterward, when they got back to their home in Indiana, their brothers came to them and felt like this was improper, we shouldn't be doing this. And John Funk understood that, and understood that maybe the Mennonites might not appreciate this as much as some people. Daniel Brenneman was not willing to back down and was excommunicated eventually. But then there were some other revivalist preachers that came through. John Kaufman, A.D. Wenger, George Brunk, and his son, George Brunk II. George Brunk II was very famous for his tent revivals, a lot like Moody and the other revivalists of the Protestants. He would, got a big tent. His brother was the song leader, and they went around to all these different communities and held revivals. And then the book also gives some weaknesses of revivalism. and this kind of goes hand in hand with that chart that I had earlier. Um, Sometimes that sort of altar call mentality and that fire and brimstone started feeling like manipulation of like, you're just trying to force me to come be saved, or I'm going to go to hell, and I'm not going to say I want to go to hell, so like, I guess I have to come forward. When it's sometimes a little more complicated than that, or we have to see it as discipleship as well. It also started bringing younger and younger conversions, which again was hard for the Anabaptists of how do we deal with that. If we believe baptism should be a conscious choice and our kids are, being saved, is there just kind of a time period there where they're saved but not baptized? How do we deal with that all? And that was something that they had to figure out. But there were some groups that split off of the Mennonites then in reaction to this revivalism because they didn't like it. The Whistler churches, the Old Order Mennonites, Weaverland Conference, and the Markham churches in Canada there. So those are some that are still pretty conservative today that would have split off mostly because of revivalism at that time. And this was all early 1900s here. All right, so in talking about this, so for each of these lessons I picked out at least one or two of the questions from the book. And the question I want to ask you, and I want to hear your feedback, is what is the place of emotional expression in the life of the church? How do we think about, especially thinking about the Pietists and the Revivalists and their emphasis on emotional expression, and then we know how we today are a little more shy about that and not willing to do as much. What is the place of that in the church? Should we be doing more? Should we be doing less? What do you think about that?
I totally understand her reaction to what they were saying, but I think we're a little too shy with our emotions.
So for sure in our singing and in the preaching of the word, there should be some kind of emotion should come out. And I guess, yeah.
I mean, I think so, yeah.
You don't raise your hands high and large. Maybe perhaps emotionless worship, praise and worship has taken, fill the gap there in people that leave our denominations.
Yeah. You're saying we're not emotional enough, and so then people feel a lack, and that could be some of the reason why they leave. Yeah.
Or maybe when they, I don't know why they leave.
Or, yeah.
When they leave, it tends towards that.
Uh-huh.
It's maybe not right to set emotion against reverence. Maybe reverence is a quiet emotion as well. But I think to try to put this on a graph and say, well, what's enough, what's too much, what's not enough, really, we are vessels of the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God moves us to worship. I think when it's something that we are at His control. And so I think we have to be careful that we don't legislate too strongly. And sometimes we have set places where that's allowed to happen, and others where it's not. I don't know. It can make our services more predictable and comfortable, perhaps. Maybe sometimes it can rule out some emotion where it could.
Yeah, I like what you said about reverence also being an emotional response. But yeah, and I think it does come down to that of, if the Spirit moves us to worship, are we open to that Spirit to express it in the way that we should?
I don't think it says that Beachy Church has not been affected by this. I mean, I
Lloyd mentioned the lifting, raising hands, and I know that's something that came up in concerns a little while ago, but just the thing of having a natural expression of worship that the Bible mentions, but that we're uncomfortable with doing much of, maybe it could be a sign that maybe we're a little bit shy of expressing emotion.
Well, I think one of the dangers of being as stoic as we are is it allows us to sit in church and not even listen, and just completely zone out. And so, when the pastor is praying, or when the superintendent beginning the service is praying, we don't have to engage. And it takes discipline to engage, and I mean, maybe a good place for us to start would be just to always say amen along with the prayer, in the prayer, as an assent that we heard was being prayed and we agreed. So, you know, if we don't want to stand up and raise our hands or whatever, can we start to show at least some form of engagement to prove that we're actually present?
Yeah.
So was the lifting of the holy hands never a ordinance or anything, why not?
I don't know much about the history of it. I don't think it was. Probably because Daniel Kaufman didn't put it in his book. I don't know.
How do we pick and choose ordinances?
I don't really know. I think a lot of the ordinances we have come from Daniel Kaufman's book, Doctrines of the Bible, and that's what he chose. But I don't know, maybe someone else knows.
Is maybe 8 or 9 or 10. Also, excommunication would perhaps be the ordinance, outward sign of a spiritual happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone else knows any more about ordinances or why lifting up of holy hands is not one. All right, well, thank you for your thoughts, and I don't know, I for one, I'm kind of on the side of Nate there. If we want to start doing that, I wouldn't be opposed to it, but moving on to the next chapter. Modernity and fundamentalism. So we're going to move now into some other things that affected the church in the early 1900s. And the first thing that we need to realize is that the 1800s and early 1900s was a time of a lot of change in the world. There were advances in science and technology, and with that came a confidence in human achievement and reason, which then led to questioning the validity of the supernatural. Now, a lot of this started back farther, and you can trace the philosophy back to the 1700s. But there came to be this idea that man can do a whole lot with his reason. And this came about with advances in science as we started learning more about the world and how it works, as we started, making stuff like the steam engine, and suddenly we could, do all this stuff that we couldn't before. And it kept advancing, obviously. And as we do that, and as we make things and we discover things, we start to realize, wow, look at all this stuff we've made and discovered, and aren't humans real great? And it's amazing what humans can do with their reason. Just by thinking things out, they can, invent these things. They're very creative, all that. But along with that came this questioning of the supernatural. As we start to rely on science and realize that man's really great because of all its science, we start being like, well, things that science can't prove obviously don't exist or aren't real or don't matter. And so that's sort of the idea that I want you to think about. That's kind of the cultural, broad cultural philosophy that is everywhere in the early 1900s. And that is often referred to as modernity or modernism as a philosophy. But that idea that man can achieve a lot through his reason. And in the early 1900s, the book gives a couple things that, the ways that Anabaptists bucked up against this, or came up against this. First off was technology. Suddenly there's this technology, how much do we engage with it? One of the questions he's had in there was, do we use electricity? Is that something we should do? And that kind of goes along with simplicity, or should we keep our things more simple? And simplicity also in dress. As the world standards, especially for women, started changing more and more, how do we do that? Do we follow them? Do we stick to our own versions of simplicity and what we want there? And then another one the book gives there that doesn't tie directly with modernity, but something that was coming in for Protestant churches was the premillennialism, and along with that, the idea of prophecy meetings that were happening. And I don't know a whole lot about that, but he mentions those things that were coming into the Mennonite church. So that's kind of to set the stage in the early 1900s. 4, fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is a movement that was formed in response to modernity. So think again, this questioning of the supernatural, this idea of science and reason that man can reason all these things, so therefore the things that are supernatural can't exist. And so along with that was liberal theology. So even Christians were starting to come to this place where they were questioning the supernatural. They were starting to question, did these miracles that the Bible talks about really happen? Was Jesus actually God, or was he just a really good man? Things like that liberal theology started questioning. And liberal theology is often associated with German thought, because a lot of the liberal theologians that started the movement were kind of there. Along with that came, what's the term? I forget it now. But also questioning the Bible and the validity of the Bible, and viewing it as higher criticism. That's what I was looking for. Looking at the texts and saying, these were just written by men, and we can just look at them in that way. So there's nothing actually supernatural here. It's just a flawed book that came from men. So there were a lot of Christians who said we need to do something about this. And so from 1910 to 1915, there was a series of books called The Fundamentals, which was released. And this was to combat these liberal theologians. And basically what the fundamentals was a series of writings or essays defending parts of the Christian faith. One of the big things for them was the inerrancy of the Bible. There were other things about supernatural, accepting the supernatural, so on and so forth. Kind of direct response to liberal theology. So whatever liberal theology was questioning, the fundamentals said that's not true. And throughout this time, many of the Mennonite leaders started picking up these emphases and the wording as well from the fundamentals, and started preaching in that way as well. And then in 1921, the Mennonites wrote what was called Christian Fundamentals. I think sometimes it's called the Garden City Statement or something like that, because it was written in Garden City, Missouri. But it was basically that. It was a doctrinal statement for the Mennonites. And I think it's actually kind of what our statement of faith is based off of. I know it's gone through a lot of editing and changes over the years, but there is a lot of the wording in there that comes from the wording in the Christian Fundamentals as well. So that's some of where we get that. So then the book also gives some differences between fundamentalism and Anabaptism, and especially the Anabaptism of that day, the things they bucked up against, the things that they disagreed with fundamentalism in. The first thing is that fundamentalism relied on a stated, reasoned theology, and Anabaptism focused on living well. So fundamentalism kind of took modernity, took modernism, and said, all right, we'll play with you. Here's our list. Modernism was all about reason, science, writing out, this is what's true. And the fundamentalists said, all right, we'll do that for us. And here's our list of things that are true, and here's why. Anabaptists were a little more skeptical and said, Christianity isn't just a list of things that were written down. It's not just a systematic theology. Christianity is living well. Our faith is not just a list of things that are true, it's a life that's lived out. Jesus didn't he preached to his disciples, but he didn't preach a systematic theology and say, here's what you need to believe about God, here's what you need to believe about the Bible, here's what you need to believe about such and such. He preached to them, but what he preached was right living, and he lived that out. He lived out what it means to be a Christian. And so that's where the Anabaptists kind of reacted against fundamentalism. Secondly, fundamentalism was strongly patriotic, as opposed to the Anabaptists who were non-resistant. Fundamentalists were mostly American, and I'm not exactly sure how that worked, but somehow in this, strong listing out of what's true, came with it a patriotism and a Christian nationalist, even like America is God's chosen country. But the Anabaptists weren't so sure about that and were non-resistant in their beliefs. And thirdly, fundamentalism put authority in church leaders, whereas Anabaptists put the authority in the church. So fundamentalists said, what's right is having right doctrine is what's important. So we need preachers who are strong leaders who can preach this doctrine and preach it right. Anabaptists said, along with priesthood of all believers and along with having their leaders being chosen from their ranks, that authority lies in the church. We have things like brotherhood agreements. It's not just about one man saying what's right and everyone else following along. It's about the church deciding how they're going to live. And there are also there would be some other differences, but this is kind of the three main ones that the book talked about. But it also mentioned that with that last one, that started to change. Over the 30s, 40s, 50s, as broader culture started changing and their standards for dress and so on changed, and Mennonites had this tendency to kind of follow along, we started making more written rules. And so that authority changed a little bit as leaders started taking more of a strong leadership rule of saying now their role is to police these standards or to say, to call out the person who's not following the standards and so on. And so some of that authority kind of started to change as well there. But that's not to say, seeing those differences is not to say that Anabaptism wasn't influenced by fundamentalism. It very much was. Like I said, we had that 1921 statement of faith, and those written out statements was a very big deal, and still is to this day, of having a written out theology. And also some of that sort of mentality, I think, of argument and apologetics, where we're going to meet modernism on modernism's terms and say, okay, well, if you're going to do that, then here's our list of what's right and what's wrong. When at the end of the day, you can't reduce God to that, and you can't prove God by science. But that's not to say that we haven't tried. Another thing that started happening in the late 1800s and early 1900s was higher education. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were some Mennonite colleges formed, and he lists out these 5. Bethel, Elkhart Institute, which later became Goshen College, Bluffton, Heston, and Eastern Mennonite College were all formed within the first, by the end of the first couple decades of the 1900s. And many of the conservative leaders around this time were college educated. He gives a whole list there. Let's see if I can find the list. Daniel Kaufman, John Horsch, A.D. Wenger, Harold Bender, John Wenger, Sanford Shetler. A lot of the writers and the leaders of conservative thought in this time period were college educated and educated at these schools, but also taught at these schools. And But over the decades, these colleges started getting more accultured, started becoming more liberal, and that just made conservatives even more skeptical of higher education and saying, oh, higher education just makes you more liberal and more, you just blend in with culture more when you do that. Which is something that I think is still in our churches today. And then in 1914, World War I started, and a few years later in 1917, America joined the war. And they passed the Selective Service Act of 1917, which called for a draft of young men to join the Army. And we talked about in the last lesson that in drafts like the Revolutionary War, and I think we didn't talk about it, but I think the Civil War as well, you could pay a fine to get a substitute. So if you were a conscientious objector, you could pay a fine. But that was not allowed under this one, and so you had to go and serve. And many of them were given non-combat roles, but a lot of the Mennonites and religious conscientious objectors didn't feel like that really made a difference, and they weren't going to help the war effort, as it were. And along with this, of course, as with any war, there was a strong fervor of patriotism coming through, and so then these people get looked down on and ridiculed and persecuted for being conscientious objectors, and it kind of makes sense. As humans, these soldiers were going out to war to risk their lives for their country, and here were some other people who weren't willing to do that, and so they're easy targets to ridicule. I just want to read some from the book here about what happened to some of these conscientious objectors. I'll be reading from page 109 and 110. These conscientious objectors were frequently roughly handled by petty officers who had little sympathy for their scruples, nor for the law under which they were permitted to enter non-combatant service. 18 men one night were aroused from their sleep and held under cold showers until one became hysterical. Another objector had the hose played upon his head, he was beaten, until he became unconscious. Men were forced to stand at attention, sometimes with outstretched arms, for hours and days at a time, on the sunny or cold side of their barracks, exposed to the inclemencies of the weather, as well as to the jeers and taunts of their fellows, until they could stand no longer. Some were chased across the fields at top speed by their guards on motorcycles until they fell down exhausted. Occasionally, they were tortured by mock trials in which the victim was left under the impression to the very last that unless he submitted to the regulations, the penalty would be death. Every conceivable device, ridicule, torture, offer of promotion, and other tempting inducements were resorted to in order to get them to give up their convictions. But with only a few exceptions, the religious objectors refused to compromise. And it also mentions some Hutterite COs who were killed from the mistreatment they received. And so that was a lot of what they faced in World War I. It was not a great time for conscientious objectors, but many of them did stay true and held to their beliefs. But it also mentions that after the war, Mennonites helped a lot in restoration efforts in Europe and restoring war-torn regions. So a question for this chapter, as we think about modernity and fundamentalism and how the Anabaptists face that: what is the value of written statements of faith, and what are their limitations? Any thoughts? So I guess the first, sorry, go ahead.
One thing you sort of mentioned earlier is the written statements can sort of tend to be something to fall back on and not move on to right living, and just sort of relying on theological statements rather than living a spirit-filled disciple life. One value I see is that it clarifies what we do believe.
Sorry, what was it?
We're very strong on writing things down.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
Some of that might be just that culturally we are in a position where we can do that now, and we're in one place with a fixed group of people more than we were before.
And I don't, like, statements of faith aren't a new thing. Conrad, you talked about in your lesson with the creeds that the early church was very adamant about getting written down and figuring out, and they, argued all through that. We have the Schleitheim Confession and the Dordrecht Confession from the early Anabaptists. It's not like written statements were a new thing in the 1900s. And I think there is a place for them. I think there's a place where we need to, like Orion said, define what we mean. And it's easy for, outsiders to say, what do you believe? And we say, here you go, this is what we believe. But one of the limitations I see is, do we actually believe that? Are we actually living out what it says? Or are we just, does that kind of make us content and we say, okay, we made our statement, now we know what we believe and that's all that matters? Or are we actually living that out? And is that actually what we believe with our lives? Yeah, all right, we will keep moving on to the third lesson. Which is entitled Upheaval and New Groups. And we start this lesson off, where the last one ended, with a world war. In 1940, there was a Selective Service Act, which allowed for conscientious objectors. You'll notice that, for those of you who know anything about World War II, that this was passed in 1940, and the U.S. didn't actually join the war until 1941, but it was a little bit preemptive. They were kind of expecting it, but also just kind of getting this out there that they can establish a draft. And I think they sort of had ages, I forget what it was, but it was a little bit smaller range of ages that they required people to register for the draft. And then once the U.S. actually joined the war, they broadened that to the 18 to 35, I think. But in this war as well, COs were required to do alternative service, but that didn't mean that they had to, work at an army base or work with the army. They could, work in some way that, I forget what the wording was, but furthered the well-being of the country, basically. So a lot of them served in hospitals. The book says that almost half of Mennonite COs served in hospitals, and that was under the 1W program. And some of that, so these conscientious objectors were not allowed to serve in their home communities. So if you were drafted, you were a conscientious objector, you were doing alternative service, you would be doing it in another community. And this caused a lot of young men especially, the young men who were drafted, to kind of lose touch with their home communities and lose touch with some of their faith, and start leaving the faith. And so there were some efforts to kind of keep that from happening. Some of the Mennonites developed 1W units that provided housing for groups of COs, which had married couples who served as their unit leaders. So basically the COs could live together in a house with other Mennonites, and could kind of stay connected in that way. But it was a trying time. And it also talks about some of the conditions in these hospitals were not great, especially the mental hospitals that some of these worked at. This was a time where mental patients were not treated very well. And some COs, he didn't say specifically Mennonite COs, but some COs who were working in these Mennonite hospital, or these mental hospitals, actually smuggled cameras in and helped to kind of alert the public to what was going on in these, and that led to reforms in mental health facilities and how we treat the mentally ill. But yeah, this 1W service was not necessarily easy or fun, but it was provided for under the Selective Service Act of 1940 that there could be conscientious objectors. In 1920, the Mennonite Central Committee, or MCC, was formed. And it was formed after some Russian Mennonites came from Ukraine and told Mennonites in America about the things they were suffering. So if you remember from Wednesday night, there were Mennonites in Russia, and when the Bolsheviks revolted and the Soviets took over the country, a lot of Mennonites were caught in the crossfires. It wasn't great. Their farms were ravaged. They lost a lot of their stuff, and so they were suffering. And so these Mennonites came to America and said, "Hey, this is what's up." And so in response to that, Mennonite leaders formed MCC to offer aid to them. And so it offered aid to Mennonites, but also to others in the area that were hurt by this. And then later on in World War II, it administered some alternative service projects. It administered the civilian public service and also helped to, in recovery efforts after the war, under what was called the PAX program, to help with the war-torn regions. In 1955, they added the Mennonite Disaster Service, which was kind of its own thing, had existed, but then it came under the umbrella of MCC in 1955 to help victims of natural disasters. And it's still around today. It still offers material assistance to people in poor countries. I think, for the most part, it's run by liberal Mennonites, but I was talking to Dad today, and apparently there is still a Beachy representative on the board of that, and there are other groups as well. So it's kind of a broader Anabaptist group. I know even the Amish are involved or were involved in some ways as well. But I think a lot of the administration and stuff is handled by the liberal Mennonites, and MCUSA specifically. Speaking of liberal Mennonites, around the 50s and 60s, there started to be acculturation within the Mennonites. And in response to that, as these groups got more liberal, there were some groups that split off. And the book lists a whole bunch of these. I listed a few here that we might be more familiar with. The Easterns split off in 1968. And then the Mid-Atlantic Fellowship broke off the Easterns because they didn't like how conservative the Easterns were going. And then another one I listed there was BMA in 1999, which withdrew from the Conservative Mennonite Conference. The Conservative Mennonite Conference was actually had come from the Amish. They were the Amish Mennonites for a while, and all the names are very confusing, but that's just a few of the ones that broke off from groups that were moving more liberal, and they didn't want that as much, which is, I think, maybe interesting. That was something interesting that when I started learning about the Mennonites, as a Beachy, as someone who came from the Amish and so on, to see that a lot of the conservative Mennonites that we interact with are kind of moving the opposite way than we are, or like we broke off of more conservative groups, and they broke off of more liberal groups, and now we're, a lot of our practices are pretty similar. But that's just an interesting thing to realize about a lot of those, Mennonite groups. All right, some other movements in the Mennonite Church. So this isn't the Mennonite Church, but in the 1960s, there was a movement of the youth to reject authority, basically, and they were very anti-establishment. They were called hippies. They rejected societal rules and authority, and pushed back on these cultural expectations. Rock music became a big thing and a way to express yourself and do the next thing that is going to make your parents ashamed. And it was kind of this thing of leaving authority. And this started creeping in, especially in Mennonite colleges in this time, which again just made conservatives' distrust of higher education even stronger, as a lot of these college campuses became places where students were anti-establishment, trying to reject authority, and so on. One of the ways that Mennonites tried to counter this, according to the book, and I'm interested to hear what you know about this and how you, like if you've heard of this. I've heard of it, but not the Mennonites' involvements necessarily. But the book says that a lot of Mennonites in this time turned to the teaching of Bill Gothard, who was a conservative Christian leader, or somewhat conservative, who had teachings for how to raise children. His big thing was a chain of command, and so this idea of authority, and like children are under parents who are under church leaders and so on. I've heard about him from like involvement with the Duggars and so on, but I don't know. Is this something that people like in the Mennonites did a lot of? I'm not really sure. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And in more recent years, I think there was a lot of scandal with sexual abuse allegations and so on against Bill Gothard, and he's not the most respected man anymore. But yeah. All right. So some questions from this chapter, and I have 3 here, and this will take the rest of our time, as much time as you want it to take, I guess. First question, have conservative Mennonites withdrawn too far from societal issues? Are there ways we ought to be more involved in such ills as homelessness, foster care, teen pregnancies, trafficking, addictions, etc.? And I think this is coming from liberal Mennonites are very strong on societal outreach and very strong on doing a lot of this stuff. So the question is, have we withdrawn too much from that? And should we be doing more?
I think the element with MCC is I would hesitate with is as soon as it becomes political, like pro-Gaza, Palestinian, down in Florida, all this sort of stuff. So I think it's probably why we withdraw from MCC, more than just that the liberals become political in nature. So,
Yeah. Well, and that's something that you have to, as you look at these, the ones he lists there, the problems he lists there, many of those are ones that are pretty political. So that's something you have to deal with, is how do we, if we should be doing more, how do we do that without becoming political?
well, Jesus was definitely involved in some, if not all, of these.
Mm-hmm.
He knew how to touch people's lives.
I think being involved in stuff like this can make us a little bit more uncomfortable and put us into challenging situations sometimes. And I think sometimes a natural tendency is to just stay away from it, stay uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's the reason for not getting more involved, then it's absolutely, or it can be a problem.
There are a lot of political organizations that have a lot of experience in dealing well with these situations. And it can be valuable to plug into them. But then there are going to be some things that we run into because they're
Yeah, it's definitely not comfortable to help people and to confront issues like this. But I don't think that means it's bad. All right, moving on to the next question. How should we think about the splintering among conservatives? How do we reconcile this with Jesus' prayer for oneness? Should we be splitting more or splitting less? Or any thoughts?
I'm not gonna lie, it's kind of depressing reading all this history, because like, oh, glad going out further and further and further.
Mm-hmm.
I was really troubled too by, some of the stuff you read in this book about how these people treat each other and excommunicate
Yeah, I think with what Linford said, that's very important. Like, I think one of the biggest things to combat splintering is having a common vision and having a mission. I heard something recently that I thought was a good analogy for this. So I was watching a video about the benefits of exercising regularly, and one of the big things was that it doesn't seem like your body actually like burns more energy or anything when you exercise after a while once your body gets used to it. But one of the things it does is that it wears out your body in a way so that if you don't exercise a lot, your immune system starts attacking things that aren't that important, and starts causing problems in that way, and especially like joints and stuff. And so exercising is a way to use up that energy so there's not left over for your immune system to attack stuff it doesn't need. And I thought that was a really good analogy for church. If we are using all our energy to, further the kingdom and, build our mission, we're not going to have as much time to argue about the little things that don't actually really matter in church, and split all over the place. But yeah, I also think with what Lloyd said, there is a positive here that like people who don't care about their faith aren't going to be splitting churches. So if we're splitting churches, that means we do care, and so that's at least a starting place. But I definitely don't think we need to be doing it as much as we are. All right, and one last question. How can we value traditions in practice without idolizing them? How do we stay true to our tradition without making that the end-all, be-all of who we are? Is it possible?
I think we need to look at tradition as a means to an end. Traditions are not ends in themselves. We can value the traditions that lead us into the right thing, but they're not an end in themselves.
We don't follow traditions just to be traditional or anything.
It really helps to know why we do what we do. It's sort of more meaningful than
Mhm.
just practice itself.
Mhm. Yeah, I think those go hand in hand there. If we know why we do something, that it's a means to something else, I think that we could value it without, idolizing it, and realizing what we actually value is the end, or where it gets us. Yep. Well, I think just in summing up there a little bit, I think something to remember is, we have to get to the point there as well where we decide what is the important part, or what, talking about church splitting again, and churches that split over traditions and, the way we do things versus the way we want to do things. And we have to realize, is it that important? And if it is, why are we doing what we're doing? And is it an ends to the correct means? All right, well, I will close in prayer yet, and then you may be dismissed. Dear God, thank you for leading us in studying Anabaptist history, and I pray that as we go from here, we would go with a renewed vision for serving you, for interacting with those around us and reaching out to them, and that we would continue building your kingdom. I pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.